I've got to start again. Sorry. David and I discussed putting a book together over a number of years, and the concept was to have an all-encompassing book, but then decided the idea would be to cover just 1 year at a time. And we decided to focus on 1983, which was David's most successful tour, and also the first tour in which he became a global superstar. The title of the book is Ricochet, David Bowie 1983. It doesn't have the title of the tour in it because really the tour was an opportunity to take the photographs. Ricochet was a track on the Let's Dance album, and we're going to feature that as a 12-inch single alongside Let's Dance. And this will be specially produced by us and for us, and will be remastered by Nile Rodgers, who produced the original Let's Dance album. The conversations took place over a period of a number of years. First of all, beginning straight after the tour when I actually produced a book, Serious Moonlight, then again 10, 15 years later, and then it took another 10 years for it to come to fruition, which was shortly before David died. So we had to postpone, and we obviously at that point couldn't include David's signature any longer. This book was made with David's full support. The photographs were selected by him and approved. Many of them were approved on the road when David would come to my room and I would give a slideshow, and he would say yes, no, save it for a book, save it for the press. So many of those photographs were approved at the time. Many more were then approved following some of these tours. There will be a number of memorabilia items in the book, many of which I kept from the tour at the time, not knowing what I may end up doing with them. And a lot more I sourced through David's archive by going through a terminal in his office and choosing the elements that I'd like to include in the book. The 1983 Serious Moonlight tour was special because it was David's break into the big time. He became a superstar, global superstar, and the tour had begun in much smaller venues than it ended up playing in. So David was as caught out and surprised as anyone. The original tour was in indoor arenas of about 10,000, and it switched into much bigger arenas, 60 to 80,000. Even in the UK, David played Wembley Arena, which at the time was about 11,000, and then had to add 3 Milton Keynes with 65,000 people a night. It was a very happy tour. David was breaking into the big time, so this was a new experience for him. He was proving to be very popular. He broke into new territories, especially America, where he'd been a cult artist. So the whole atmosphere on the tour was happy from beginning to end. I had unprecedented, unrestricted access, so it meant that obviously I travelled with David, we stayed in the same hotels, we would often go out together. I had unrestricted access backstage into the dressing rooms, etc., which anyone on the tour did on the touring party with David, which was around 20 people, which included security, tour personnel, makeup, etc. There are a lot of offstage pictures because David, first of all, after the first few shows, would get bored if he saw too many live photographs, unless they were exceptional in that they were very different. So there was a new venue, it was daylight, which it was in Scandinavia, etc. So after about half a dozen shows, really he wanted to see more offstage pictures. So a lot of those only included David collecting his bags at the airport or sitting on the plane, but at least it meant it was a side of David that had never been seen before, because at that point he was still the cult figure and the enigma. Occasionally we were able to get away from the restrictions of the tour itself, and it was usually in major cities, London, New York, Los Angeles, and unusual cities such as Berlin, and again in Southeast Asia when there was an extra leg of the tour. One of the London episodes was when David was being measured for his figure in Madame Tussauds, and one of the photographs in the book shows the girl comparing his eyes. That's for 2 reasons, obviously. One is that they need to get the eyes right, and the other is that David had 2 different eyeballs. So the girl came out with a rack of eyeballs and then held them up and just compared them to him face to face. The rest of the session mainly involved the girl measuring David's face with calipers. So they use a lot of photography, but also a lot of literal measurements of his face. Well, I got the opportunity of capturing David doing something that might seem mundane for someone else, but for him, it was him out of his normal touring environment. So instead of being in the private jet, which most of the tour was done on, it would be David on a commercial flight in a normal seat, and then that became an unusual picture. Usually the bags were all collected by someone on the tour and they'd be delivered to us in our room, but occasionally David collected his own bags, and that then became an unusual picture. With anyone else, it'd be a pretty run-of-the-mill. David was renowned for being scared of flying, and he had done some of his earlier tours on a train, and on the train he included a library of books to keep himself entertained over those long journeys. But he was told that if he wanted to break into the big time, put together a huge global tour, that he was told either he had to fly or it wouldn't happen. So he chose to fly, and there were occasional anecdotal moments regarding that. There are a lot of offstage pictures also, because at the end of the tour we went to Southeast Asia, and there were fewer shows there and there were smaller shows. And there was one per country. So it meant that David and I were able to get out and about, and he was also being filmed for a documentary on that leg of the tour. So he would do a lot of things that he might not have done or had no time to do at any other part of the tour. So Southeast Asia could almost have been a book in itself. David's archive from the 1983 tour and 1987 tour was split between his office in New York and mine in London. So I knew a lot of the material that I had on David, and I knew which ones were my favourites and that I had available. So I also went over to David's office to have a look at what he had, which was another 10,000 on top of the 10,000 that I had. So it meant that a lot of these pictures had never been seen by me, even in the 34 years since they were taken, although David had been through some of them in the ensuing period and added to the number that he'd either approved or unapproved. There's a well-known photograph of David standing in a restaurant in Japan with his pork pie hat on, and it's very posed, but in fact the photograph was never intended to be taken that way. It's simply because we'd been sitting on the floor having dinner just below where that photograph was taken, and those photographs show David in a very relaxed atmosphere, laughing and joking, and then he stood up to leave, and then when we took a pose photograph, then he turned more into the David that people normally see. Which again, in the book, there are a lot of photographs that show the other side of David, which hadn't really been seen at the time either. It's been heard of more now since he died, and people said how funny he was and how light-hearted, but at the time no one really had seen that side of him. But I had already documented it, and those pictures were still sitting around unseen. There was also another interesting day in Berlin when Helmut Newton had asked to do a session with David for Vanity Fair of celebrities sitting on the edges of their beds, and David only agreed to do the session if he said that I could document it too, which was great. But then when I published my photographs, Helmut Newton called up my agent to ask where we'd been using his. The idea behind the book really was that this period would be documented properly for once and for all, and would never be revisited in such a major way. So it had to be an ambitious book in order to be able to cover the period and do David justice and do the photographs justice. As we went through the design process and I went through the picture selection process, I obviously kept in mind what David had approved and disapproved and unapproved, because there was a difference between unapproved and disapproved. Disapproved usually involved a heavy Sharpie squiggle through the photograph. And really everything was, would David have been okay with this picture, even if maybe it was something that he didn't like as much as another photograph, but would he have been happy with it? Would it be a lasting legacy for that tour in particular and my photographs of David? So I thought that it would, yes. It's the sort of, you've always got him peering over your shoulder.